Hello and welcome to another episode of Food with the Rumseys. I am David Rumsey, of course. And before we get started here, I'd like to give a special shout out to Milo Svek. He actually made the recipe for our French-style bread and then used it as show and tell for his class, and that was just fantastic. Hope you enjoyed this episode, Milo. So today we are going to be making biscuits. And the biscuits we're going to make could be used for biscuits and gravy. You could use them just to make a breakfast sandwich, or you could use them even just with some butter and jam on them. They're delicious. So I've pre-measured a lot of my ingredients here just to kind of speed things up here, but what we're going to need to start here with is this is just all-purpose flour, and I'm going to get 3 cups of it into our bowl. And then to that 3 cups of all-purpose flour, I'm going to actually add 4 teaspoons of baking powder. Now, if you don't bake a lot, you should always check to make sure your baking powder is not expired. If the baking powder is expired, it's not going to give you the same kind of lift. And then a half a teaspoon of cream of tartar, actually. And then a whole teaspoon of salt. Remember, we want salt for flavor in these recipes. Now, if you use salted butter, I would probably reduce this to about a half a teaspoon of salt. We use unsalted butter in all of the recipes here on Food with the Rumseys. And so we have a little bit extra salt. So this is a teaspoon of salt. And then I'm just going to use a little bit of a whisk just to kind of combine this together a little bit. Now, the secret to making good biscuits is to not mix your butter all the way in. You're going to want to have chunks of butter left in it. And some people, what they do is they'll actually even refrigerate the dry ingredients for even like, or freeze them even for like 20 or 30 minutes to keep them nice and cold. You really want to be working with some of this stuff when it's cold because you don't want to mix the butter in. And so what I have here though is I have 3/4 cup of butter that I've already pre-cut up. And that's a stick and a half of butter, and I've cubed it, and then what I did is I actually stuck it in the freezer for a few minutes to really make sure it's nice and cold. You don't want it frozen, but you want it nice and cold. And so I'm going to dump the butter in, and then I'm going to use a pastry cutter here. If you don't have a pastry cutter, you can actually use your hands to do this, to break it up a little bit, but you might even be able to use a fork or a knife or even a food processor. If you have a food processor, you can kind of pulse it at this point. But I like to just use my pastry cutter. And you can kind of see here, I'm trying to angle the bowl here without getting all of my dry ingredients out. I'm just kind of cutting up these, and I just knocked a bunch out here. I'm just trying to get these pieces cut a little bit smaller here. We don't want this to be, as I said, mixed completely. You're still going to have chunks of butter in this. And this is actually something that when I started making biscuits, I struggled with quite a bit because I always wanted to mix things always like super thoroughly together and have everything all mixed together. And it kind of goes against what I wanted to do, and the fact that you actually want to leave chunks of butter in the flour here. And when you even make the dough finally, you're going to have chunks of butter in the dough. And at first it doesn't look like it's going to cook right, but trust me, it will turn out fantastic. Okay, so that's, I think, about good enough here. Let me just do a couple more. And I'll show you here. So you can see here there are still chunks of butter here. Like here's a chunk of butter, here's some chunks of butter. Like, you know, they're almost pea size, maybe even a little bit bigger than a pea size. You know, chunks of butter that are still here in the flour. So that's what we want. We want to have those chunks of butter still there. Now we're going to add our wet ingredients to this mixture. And the wet ingredients is 1 cup of milk, 1 cup of buttermilk, and then 1 egg that we're going to beat. Now, if you don't have buttermilk, that's fine. But the important thing is you need to then sour the milk. So a way to sour your milk if you don't have buttermilk like we have here is you put a tablespoon of vinegar. You can use apple cider vinegar or white vinegar. You put a tablespoon of vinegar at the bottom, and then you fill this up to 1 cup, and that will sour the milk for you. And even if you don't want to use milk, like if you're lactose intolerant, I actually made this recipe a couple of weeks ago, and I actually used a tablespoon of vinegar and then used almond milk, which has no, obviously it's not milk at all, and it still worked fine, and they turned out great. So you don't have to use milk, but buttermilk's going to make them taste fantastic. And so the other thing we need is 1 egg here. So I'll crack my egg here. And then I'm going to beat this up a little bit. Doesn't need to be like super beat up, but just slightly beaten here. So it's kind of mixed up like that. And then we're going to pour the egg in here. And we're going to pour the milk in. And then, as always, I like to use a wooden spoon, and I'm going to just kind of stir these ingredients together to form a dough. And the dough is going to still be relatively sticky, and it should be cold to touch almost. So you can see it doesn't even look like it's completely formed together here. And you can even still see there's the chunks of butter and everything, but this is fine. This is exactly what we want. Like I said, I know it goes against all of what you're probably used to doing here when you're making doughs or anything. So, and it will be sticky, so that's okay. So next thing we need to do, and I am going to waste some flour with this, is you want to make sure you put enough flour down on your surface here. So I put a little bit more than I need to sometimes, just to make sure I have plenty of flour. And then I'm going to take my dough, doesn't even look like it's dough yet, kind of turn it out onto this floured surface here. And then I'm going to kind of bring this all together. And do a couple, I don't even want to say kneads, but just kind of combining it all together here. I know it doesn't necessarily look very dough-like or anything, but it's exactly what we want it to be here. Just kind of getting some of the little bits of butter here. Now, I don't actually use a rolling pin. You don't really want to use a rolling pin on this. I just kind of press this out now with my hand. And we're going to press it out so it's like about a half an inch, I'm sorry, 3/4 to an inch thick. If it's a little less than that, that's fine. And if you have extra flour on the side, you can kind of just wipe it away. I'm trying to make it somewhat even here. You don't want to knead the dough too much. You don't want to overhandle it because we're not trying to make bread here. We're making biscuits. Now, I'm going to let the camera maybe try and zoom in on this. I don't know if you can see it, the camera here, but there's lots of bits of butter all over here. And it even feels, you can feel the butter. And as I said, when I first started making biscuits, this just feels wrong to me. Like, I should have this mixed in more. This is exactly what we want. And yeah, your hands are going to be a little bit sticky with the dough, which is fine. But now what we're going to do is we're going to take a tray here, and we're going to cut out our biscuits. Now, I have a nice little biscuit cutter. You know, I don't know what size this is, but nice little biscuit cutter. But if you don't have a biscuit cutter, that's fine. You can use a cookie cutter, actually, if you wanted to, or just use a glass. You know, you can use a glass to make your biscuits. And then you put them on the parchment tray. But I'll use my biscuit cutter that I have. And so I'm just going to cut out my biscuits here. one's a little thick, that's okay. I'll just be a big one. And now, say, well, what do we do with all this leftover dough? Well, that's where you kind of bring it back together. And then I'm going to pat it down and cut out some more biscuits. And then you just keep doing that. I usually get somewhere between 10 and 12 biscuits, depending on how thin I make it. I'm then going to take this tray and put it in the oven, a 450-degree oven. And I don't remember how long I'm going to bake it, so let me check here real quickly on my tablet to see how long we bake these. 10 to 15 minutes, or until golden brown. Now they should lift up. You'll notice that there will be a little bit of butter that leaks out. That's normal, but they'll rise up and you'll get nice, good, tender biscuits. So again, 10 to 15 minutes.